Okay, hello all. Today I want to talk to you about the Decembrist revolt. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm already sharing my screen with you so you can see it there. Now, as you'll recall, when Alexander the First died down, he was away from the center. He was down in Taganrog on the Crimean Peninsula. And there was a lot of confusion associated with it. His next brother, the second brother, remember Paul had 10 kids, was Grand Duke Constantine Pavlovich, also the grandson of Catherine the Great, named Constantine. And some say this pointed to Catherine's southern project that she intended to take for the Russian Empire to take Constantinople. Hence, his name Constantine was aspirational. Whatever aspirations adhered therein, Constantine was a disappointment. Catherine arranged a marriage for him, and he was so awful to his wife that she left him. Not typical in the royal dynastic world. At any rate, an agreement had been made that he would forego the throne. And this agreement, while solid, was kept secret. Remarkably, it was kept secret from the third brother, Nicholas. So when Alexander died, it added, A, it was unusual for a czar to die not in the capital. B, this issue of the succession created quite a bit of confusion. And that opened the door for the Decembrist revolt. But let me back up a little bit and take us back to the Napoleonic Wars. Orlando Figes, in his cultural history, Natasha's Dance, writes about how the experience of marching westward into Paris in the Napoleonic Wars and being in Western Europe really brought more viscerally and materially ideas afoot in the Western world to these Russian officers. They were very much inspired by emerging ideas of liberalism, that there would be constraints on monarchical authority. Not totally new, but in the 19th century, this idea of liberalism, rule by law, a monarchy constrained, uh, more participatory politics are coming to the fore. And the soldiers and the officers that took their armies into Western Europe began to imbibe these ideas to a good degree. Figes also writes about how there was something about that experience that made them more sympathetic to the soldiers that served beneath them. He has or had his graduate students read a number of journals and report back to him on them for his publications. And what one sees is a real sympathy and a beginning to question why, why do we have this a state system where just because I was born into this rank, so many different things accrue to me than accrue to soldiers. And so those sorts of thoughts can be traced beginning to emerge. And we can see that these thoughts start to get put into action gently. In 1816, several officers of the Russian Imperial Guard founded a society that they named the Union of Salvation, or also the Faithful and True Sons of the Fatherland. The society acquired a more revolutionary cast after it was joined by a more idealistic and proactive or revolutionary minded noble named Pavel Pestel. Um, but originally it was, the kind of a group coming together and reading ideas, talking about ideas. Now, in 1820, there was something of a mutiny in the Semyonov regiment. The Semyonovsky guards were among the oldest guards. They'd been a kind of privileged guard regimen created under the reign of Peter the First, and they had they advanced a petition complaining about the harsh treatment of their commander and asking to mollify what they saw as an overly harsh regime, overly harsh discipline. Remember, I talked to you a little bit about Arakcheyev and his reform ideas that manifested in a really harsh discipline. So but this action got a swift response. The company, the leaders of it were arrested, and the regiment itself was dispersed. Those soldiers were reassigned to much lower ranked infantry positions where they weren't afforded the privileges they had known in the Semyonovsky regiment. And so, in the wake of that, there was quite a chill over, what ideas are we planting and starting to spread that you're starting to have these young officers be ready to, take action to appeal for better treatment and more what they saw as fairness. So the society, the Union of Salvation, suspended its activities after the 1820 mutiny in the Semyonov revolt. Two groups, however, continued to meet in secret, and those were the Northern Society and the Southern Society. Here's some pictures of three men, Nikita Muravyov, Prince Trubetskoy, and Prince Obolensky, who were members and leaders at points in the Northern Society. So the political aims of the Northern Society were fairly moderate. They wanted a British-style constitutional monarchy that had a limited franchise, meaning, some people, property-owning men, not everyone, could have a say in determining in governance. They wanted to see the abolition of serfdom. Among any reform-minded people of the day, it was really widely recognized that serfdom probably isn't a good thing, and yet how to actually get out of it is a conundrum that generations of czars don't manage to get out of. So they want to abolish serfdom and they want equality before the law. This is a classically liberal idea, equality before the law. Now, the Southern Society had a more radical or more progressive agenda. Now, here, Pavel Pestel is one of the leaders. He had joined the Union of Salvation, and then he's in 1818 in a different group, and then in 1821 becomes the leader of what's known as the Southern Society. Now, this group has a more progressive vision. They want to abolish the monarchy altogether. They want to form a republic, and they want to not just abolish serfdom. Yes, do that. But they also are calling for a land redistribution where the state would have half the land and then peasants would get other land. And so it is, these are some of the ideas. And I want to recall that initially many officers, I mean, it isn't just that experience of marching to Western Europe that starts to plant these ideas. Alexander the First himself came to the throne with aspirations for liberal-like reforms. He had, after all, in 1817 and 18, freed serfs in the Baltic in a limited way. He'd granted Congress Poland a constitution. He had he had formed a commission to draw up a constitution. This gets abandoned. In 1819, Mikhail Speransky had been appointed as a governor of Siberia with the initial task of kind of proposing reforms of local government. And so all these things are very liberal minded. Alexander, if you were watching the early Alexander, you had many reasons to hope that real changes in Russian institutions would be afoot. However, in the wake of internal and external unrest, there were also kind of secret societies that tried to spark spark political revision in Italy, in Spain, in some Germanic lands as well. And so this, um, again, the shadow of the French Revolution is still lingers, and in the wake of this, Alexander turns more conservative, which is almost even more disappointing, right? Who was it? Alexander de Tocqueville said that the most dangerous time for any society is when it's trying to reform itself. And I don't mean to exaggerate how much reform was actually afoot in Russia, but hopes had been raised. And I think that is significant for explaining how we even get to this episode, the Decembrist Revolt, which is kind of an uprising against the state. And we'd seen, I want you to think, but cast your mind back a century, 1730, when Anna Ioannovna was afoot. We saw at this moment of transition in this a succession moment where we see an attempt to impose constraints on the monarch that is dead in the water, doesn't happen. And then we learned about the Pugachev revolt. There had been a number of Cossack revolts. This is the biggest one, in the name of a disappeared czar. So it was in the tradition of pretenderism, right? Which I do want to point out is there's a long tradition, as we've talked about in this course, of a pretenderism. That is, that ruler is illegitimate, and I'm the real ruler, which is a different take than saying that ruler is illegitimate because that kind of rulership is illegitimate. I have this other idea about how we should organize the state and legitimate power, right? Before it was just, I'm just a different ruler. Now in the 19th century, we're starting to see we want a different system. We want a more liberal system where the monarch is constrained by a constitution, for example. Everyone is equal before the law, as opposed to a different law depending on the estate. We don't quite say caste, but the estate of society that you're born into, right? So here we have these two different societies. Um, so this takes us back to now December 1925. And as I showed you, Tsar Alexander dies December 1st, 1825. Royal guards swore allegiance to the presumed heir, Constantine, who I showed you, and only then do we find out that Constantine isn't going to be czar. Nicholas doesn't even know. And Nicholas, at first, he kind of very proper when if people start telling him, "Oh, Constantine's out of the line of succession, it's you." Nicholas says, "No, I will take no move assigning any sort of power until I see myself in writing a note from Constantine saying, 'Yes, brother, I'm not going to be czar, you be czar.'" Constantine is in Poland at the time. So this inserts a delay. And it's in this period of delay and confusion that members of these secret societies and the northern societies there in St. Petersburg, but there's also a revolt in the southern society down in what's now Ukraine. And they organize a little bit. Ultimately, it's quite unorganized. But on the morning of December 14th, 1825, on Senate Square, and here's a picture, modern day picture of Senate Square. Where is Senate Square? Well, if you were to look at this picture and to the left, um, along the river to the east, you'll find the Winter Palace and the big square in front of the palace. This is a little bit downriver on the Naberezhnaya, and there is a picture of St. Isakovsky Sobor here. And then here is the statue that we've looked at that Catherine had commissioned by an Italian artist and erected, saying, from Catherine to Peter, kind of linking herself to Peter. And this right here was Senate Square. This yellow building was there at the time, very old building. You'll see that in paintings. And so on that day, A group of officers commanding about 3,000 men assembled in the Senate Square, and they refused to swear allegiance to the new Tsar Nicholas I, um, proclaiming instead their loyalty to Constantine and a constitution. Right? This is very muddled. They expected to be joined by the rest of the troops stationed in St. Petersburg so that other troops would come and there'd be a larger force, but they were disappointed. The revolt was further hampered when it was deserted by its supposed leader, Prince Trubetskoy, who had a last minute change of heart and failed to turn up. He's going to get punished anyway. His second in command was a Colonel Bolatov, also vanished from the scene. And after a hurried consultation, the rebels appointed Prince Eugene Obolinski. So here's Trubetskoy, who isn't there on the morning, and Obolensky gets put in charge as well. Muravyov is one of the thinkers behind it. And so here's another painting recreating the event. And so Obolensky's put in as a replacement leader. Now, what happens on that day? For hours, there's a standoff between 3,000 now rebel soldiers and 9,000 loyal troops stationed outside the Senate building. There may have been some shots fired, but nothing coalesces into outright battle. Also on the scene, there's a number of civilian onlookers who are like, "What's happening?" And some of them start to fraternize with the rebels. Um, but the leaders of the revolt do not call on them to participate. These are officers, and they see that civilian military divide as significant and nothing they're interested in breaching. Now, eventually, Nicholas, understanding that he's the czar, appears in person at the square. He sends a man, Count Mikhail Miloradovich, you don't need to know that name, a military hero greatly respected by ordinary soldiers, to talk with the rebels. And then, while he is delivering a speech, Miloradovich is shot dead by an officer. Here's a painting of that's death. That's him on the court. And he's shot death by an officer, Pyotr Kakhovsky. And at the same time, a rebelling grenadier squad led by Panov tries to enter the Winter Palace a little bit down the river, but fails and retreats pretty quickly. And then there's more attempts, like in the ensuing hours, there are more attempts to talk with the rebel forces. Nicholas is, the new czar is very reluctant to, he doesn't just say, put them down, open gunfire. This goes on for hours. But at some point, Nicholas does say, enough of this, and he orders the cavalry to charge on the rebels. The cavalry, however, it's an icy surface, and their horses are slipping all over on the icy cobblestones, and then they retire in disorder. And eventually, Nicholas then orders artillery pieces to open fire on the rebel soldiers that are still standing their ground. The effect is devastating. At this point, to avoid slaughter, the rebels break and run. Some attempted to regroup on the Neva River, just to the north of the Senate Square, but here they are targeted by artillery, and many of them are shot and wounded or killed. The ice was even broken by the cannon fire, and many of the dead and dying, over 1,000 people would die before this day was over. They were cast into the river, and their bodies never recovered. And so then you had the Loyal Army come in and mop things up, and police units, and that was the end of the revolt in St. Petersburg. The revolt suffered because those in charge communicated poorly with the soldiers that were involved in the uprising. The soldiers in St. Petersburg were chanting Constantine and Constitution, but when questioned, many of them reportedly believed that Constitution, Constitutia, was Constantine's wife. This may have been a rumor. In a letter, years later, or in a letter from not Kachowski to one of the generals, Kachowski had written, "The story told to your excellency that in the uprising of December 14th, the rebels were shouting, 'Long live the Constitution,' and that people were asking, 'What is a Constitution? The wife of the Highness or the Grand Duke?' is not true. It is an amusing invention." So that's from the mouth of Kachowski, someone involved at the scene. Now, while the Northern Society scrambled in the days leading up to December 14th to kind of organize what turned out to be a very botched stand, the Southern Society down in Ukraine took a serious blow. Now, rumors were afoot that they were planning something, and Pavel Pestel, whom I showed you, he was arrested in the days before anything happened down there with their regiments. But it turns out the regiment was infiltrated with kind of revolutionary uh, individuals, and so they don't hear what's happening as quickly what's happening in the capital. And at the end of December, early January, old style, they make a move to kind of have an uprising in the south, down there in the Kievan governorate. And here's a map of the region near Belytserkva and Vesilka, where some of the places involved, where we have these movements and actually loyal soldiers against these soldiers. About over 800 soldiers were involved. About 60 end up being shot dead when it's put down without too much trouble. And the some of the leaders of it are commit suicide there, but two of the main leaders, Muravyev Apastel and Bestujev Rumin, they will come up to, they will be sent up to Siberia, and they will be among the executed. Here is another picture of by Tim, a very famous artist, 19th century artist of the standoff with the Decembrists. And here is a picture where of the executions. So um, the Decembrists were interrogated, tried, and convicted. Kachowski, the excerpt of his letter, whom I just read to you, he was executed along with four others: Pavel Pestev, who was arrested in the south before it happened, as well as Muravyov Apostol and Bestujev Rumin, who were leading the Southern Society revolt. They were hanged. And in the north, it was Kondraty Relyaev, who was also a poet, and Kachowski. So in all, five were executed that had been involved. Other Decembrists, and there were many, were exiled to Siberia for the most part, a little bit what's now Kazakhstan and farther east. Now, when the five Decembrists were on the day they were hung, something unusual happened. The ropes that were being used to hang them split before any of them actually died. And this caused a sigh of relief in the crowd because, according to a centuries old tradition, any condemned prisoner who survived a botched execution would be sent free. It's like, your nerves have had enough, you can go. But rather than free these prisoners, Tsar Nicholas ordered new ropes to be brought, and the prisoners were hanged again, hanged till they were dead. This was the last public execution in Russian imperial history. Now, who were these Decembrists? Is it most of them were officers? They were, and who got to be officers in imperial Russia? Elites, noblemen. So this is sort of the best and the brightest, the people with, bright futures to look forward to and aristocratic lifestyles that many of them had come to reject. It said that the Decembrists even, this is a sort of martial move, would wear their swords to court to show that they wouldn't be involved in dancing. And there was among some of them a rejection of the more aristocratic indulgences that were so prevalent in Catherine's court, perhaps, and 18th century court life. In general, we see a kind of turn to a more conservative culture in the 19th century. We think so. If you think that culture only gets more free and more loose, that isn't necessarily the case. And I think this is one of those moments where we're witnessing in several levels a kind of uh, turn to a more conservative bearing, certainly in the court. So there's lots of suspicion among several eminent, high-ranking people in St. Petersburg society. Who else might have been in these organizations? Alexander Pushkin, the playwright Griboyedov, cultural figures like Alexei Yermolov. I will say it is said that Pushkin maybe could have been one of the members of, say, the Northern Society, but he wasn't invited to answer because people were unsure if he could be trusted. He could be unpredictable. Some of his, and if you even look through his body of work, I mean, some of his work is of a quite, transgressive nature. Some is ambiguous, and some seems to really celebrate the monarchy. Although it is said, such as his work really condemning Mazeppa as a traitor, just as Peter would have suggested. But as I've suggested to you, there's another way to look at this story. And then others in defense of Pushkin have said that, well, he just, he kind of had to do that because he himself was in hot water or had to do it. He made a choice. At any rate, here's a painting of their execution by Levinkov. And there in St. Petersburg, there is this very small monument to the Decembrists. After all, um, the Russian state, certainly into Putin's own regime, has had a very conflicted notion about how to commemorate those who would oppose and overthrow the state. Even in the Soviet Union, it wasn't so easy, even as that Marxist ideology required real celebration of those who rebelled against the exploiter class. All right. Now, so as I said, these five were executed, but many others, tens of others, Decembrists were sent into exile in Siberia. And I want to bring to your attention how the wives of many Decembrists followed their husbands into exile. And the Decembrist wife became a devotion, a symbol. Actually, here is portraits, 11 portraits, and then just one other portrait from the that I took off the website of the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library. Of these are the 11 women that followed their husbands or fiancés into exile. Many of these men were quite young, in their 20s. They hadn't yet married. And among them, one of the most, Princess Trubetskaya went, and Maria Volkonskaya, the wife of Prince Sergei Volkonsky, was among the most famous. In some part because she left some letters. She wrote letters with her mother-in-law, and these have been preserved. You can access them online. Let me know if you're interested. And so you can kind of read more about her experience. Her experience included leaving behind her just some month, not a son who was not even a year old. And very sadly, she would never see him again. He would die when he was 3 years old. So a couple years later, when they were out in Siberia. And so Maria Volkonskaya was one of 11 wives or fiancés who notably and courageously followed their husbands into exile, where they were ordered to different places to do hard labor. Sergei Volkonsky started out, I think, working in the silver mines of Nerchinsk. Some of them were moved away. Now, those of you who have already read, or those of you who still will, who have read Nihilist Girl by Sofia Kovalevskaya, will recognize here this motif of following one's man into exile. And it speaks both to the courage and the noble choices of these women, while simultaneously shining a light on their oh so limited choices. They needed to get permission from elder men in authority to go with their husbands. And then, once they did, they were unable to return to their former lives without explicit permission to do so. The Volkonskayas, by the way, will, after years, decades in Siberia, get to come back and live out their days in St. Petersburg. Volkonsky, they'll both die in the 60s. So they'll both live to see the abolition of serfdom, or the promised abolition, if not that complete execution. But I, but the Decembrists really left their mark in history, not just for this, albeit botched, move to challenge unlimited autocracy with a more progressive vision of governance in the Russian Empire, but also because of what they did with themselves when they got to Siberia. Many of them, they had to do hard labor at first. And then some of them you got kind of released from hard labor, but you had to still be in Siberia. You couldn't go back to your properties or the center. And while there are many of the Decembrists, to their credit, got involved in quite socially useful activities, they founded schools and hospitals and orphanages. And so they really modeled a life of trying to make society better. They really lived, they be the change you want to see in the world. They lived it in terms of trying to bring their liberalizing ideas into society. Volkonsky also took to wearing an untrimmed beard, rejecting, ever since Peter, you wouldn't see an elite officer with a beard. He even wore peasant clothes and socialized with many of his peasant associates. Would work the land sometimes, as they founded schools, hospitals, theater for the local schools. And it was after 30 years of exile had elapsed that Volkonsky was allowed to return to St. Petersburg. Although he lost his title and his land remained under royal possessions. Other exiles, however, chose to stay in Siberia for the rest of their days, and they'd come to prefer the relative freedom of Siberia to the court intrigues and high society of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And also, there wasn't so much for them to return to. The Decembrists became idols for the populist movement of the 1870s and also 1860s. Their advocacy for reform, their anti-serfdom platform, and the lives that they lived, how they stuck to their ideas, inspired many. In some ways, we see echoes of this. Vera here wants to be of service, right? And following a man into Siberia is the way she finds to do that. They also were inspiring to the writer Lev Tolstoy. Lev Tolstoy is descended from a very noble family, and he was a distant cousin of Sergei Volkonsky. His mother was actually a Volkonskaya, had the Volkonskaya maiden name. And here I kind of want to make a note about the relationship between history and literature. We think of Lev Tolstoy, one of the greats of world literature, not just Russian literature, world literature, the author of Anna Karenina and War and Peace. Well, War and Peace started out, his intention was to write about the Decembrists. But as he kind of got into the project, he realized it brought him more and more to the Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812 in Russia. And that's kind of where he stayed, and that's what it became a book about. But the original inspiration was to write about the Decembrists, of one of which he was descended. And, it occurs to me that, we're coming into the reign of Nicholas the First, Tsar from 1825, once the dust settles from this botched Decembrist revolt. And he'll be czar until 1855. So he has 30 years as czar of Russia. He's generally considered a quite reactionary czar. Um, One of the most scathing portraits of Tsar Nicholas I that I've ever read comes from Tolstoy's novella Haji Murad about the war in the Caucasus. Nicholas makes a few appearances, and there is nothing redeeming about him in the portrait that Tolstoy paints here. And I just find myself wondering how about, that he sent his successors with very progressive views into exile in Siberia, how that might have informed Tolstoy's vision and characterization of Nicholas. And to be sure, Nicholas goes down as a reactionary czar, but there is, as is often the case in historiography, a bit of a revisionist school among scholars of his reign. Paul Bushkovich talks about his how he made allowances for innovation and freedom of expression in the sphere of literature. Many were published, but Nicholas liked Pushkin's work, for example. And although Pushkin, had some exile and slaps on the wrists and certainly lived under the threat of punishment for expressing ideas displeasing to the court. I mean, don't let me oversell the deference to ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which are so foundational to the United States of America. Um, but Nicholas maybe wasn't entirely the ogre that he's been painted out to. Certainly, he would have liked to end serfdom too, as his predecessors would have, but no one could quite manage it. That bargain that the state depended on the nobility and the nobility, their lifestyle depended on the serfs, made it a bit of a hard conundrum to find its way out of, to get political, to kind of make the political move. Even in an autocracy, there are politics to be worked out. And if those politics aren't managed well, you end up with, well, military and palace coups, like we saw so many of in the 18th and even early 19th century. So, um, yeah, I guess I'll just end with the thought that if Nicholas wasn't entirely predisposed to be conservative, and as I said, Alexander started out with liberal aspirations, but events and time in office turned him to be more conservative in this age where I see a real turn to more conservatism. If Nicholas wasn't destined to be that anyway, forgive my overly simplistic characterization there. Certainly, the way he's welcomed into the throne with an armed, albeit incompetent revolt helped set him on that trajectory. Um, and so, with the failure of the Decembrists, Russia's monarchical absolutism would continue for almost another century, although serfdom would be officially abolished in 1861. And though defeated, the Decembrists did affect some change on the regime. The elite officer dissatisfaction forced, I mean, and a lot of people were involved in this, and it forced Nicholas to turn his attention inward to address issues of empire. In 1826, Nicholas rehabilitated Speransky. Remember, he was that, from the lower class servitor who had been called on to do reforms but fell out of favor and was even kind of ousted. He rehabilitated Speransky and asked him to begin codifying Russian law. So this is a task that is much more modest than reform how we govern Siberia. That's a much more ambitious task. codify the Russian law. Like, what laws are there? Let's bring it all into order in one place. A task that had not happened since the Ulozhenie of 1649. In the 1830s, we'll see a kind of codification of the Russian laws. So, not a super ambitious project, but a big project that hadn't been undertaken in a long time. We're going to kind of bring order and law and stability to this empire. Um, Anecdotally, after being defeated in the Crimean War, Nicholas is said to have lamented that his corrupt staff treated him worse than the Decembrists ever had. And on that, we will end. Okay. Bye bye.